more about Meghnad Saha. So please.
Thank you. Thank you so much for inviting me. It is a privilege. My interest is in socially informed intellectual history of science. And so I pay a lot of attention not only to the scientific contributions, but also in the context in which science was done. Today, of course, so in that respect, Saha is a very difficult subject, mainly because his scientific writings are very dry, unlike C.V. Raman, who's very, his language is very colorful and interesting. But Saha more than makes up, because he writes prolifically about all aspects of life. And he does that through his science, in a way, in ways that, as I read them again and again, it gives me different perspectives each time. So what I want to do today is to think about what does it mean to call Meghnad Saha an organic intellectual. Now, this word organic intellectual comes to us from Gramsci, who, when he thought about why there should be so much inequality, he was a member of the Italian Communist Party, and his contribution was very, very profound in a way that he said it is not through coercion, but rather through hegemony that people accept their conditions in life. And to maintain that hegemony, you need people who will justify the system. So there are these traditional intellectuals who are always with the state, but there are also organic intellectuals. Organic intellectuals carry out the task of their class. And today I want to talk about Saha's background, the kinds of life he led, and the ways in which he remained loyal to his own caste and class background. So I begin with the small biography, then I'll go into giving you a bit of his social writings, and then we will end there. So a social, organic intellectual thus functions as an organizer in the broadest sense of the term. Meghnad Saha was not only one of India's most prominent scientists, but also a leader immersed in the task of reforming the moral, intellectual, and political life of India from a decidedly subaltern perspective. Saha was a prolific writer. He wrote on every aspect of life, from science, religion, industrial development, education, war and famine, refugee rehabilitation, states reorganization, and to even talking about the reform of Indian calendar. He also has a paper analyzing the age of the Mahabharata. I mean, I could go on. There was nothing that he did not write about. Meghnad Saha was born on 6th October 1893 in a family of a village grocer in a small hamlet in East Bengal, now Bangladesh. The family was of modest means. Saha attended middle and high school against the wishes of his father, who had seen his hard-earned money wasted on the education of his eldest son. Meghnad was different, though. His teachers in elementary school were quick to recognize his talents and persuaded Jagannath to send his son to attend middle school some 6 miles away from his village. A local medical practitioner in Simulia, Dr. Anant Kumar Das, allowed Meghnad to live in his household, provided Meghnad washed his own dishes and helped in other household chores during his day. After finishing middle school at the top of his class, Meghnad, at the age of 12, went to the city of Dhaka to join the collegiate school with a meager scholarship, barely enough to pay his tuition. His brother, Jainath, helped pay for Meghnad's food and lodging by generously contributing 5 rupees a month. That was 25% of his salary to the schooling of his younger brother. His tenure at the collegiate school was, however, short and dramatic, as he was expelled from the school. And the reason was that I think the most unpopular governor of governor in India at that time, Bampflied Fuller, was to visit the school. And as a result, the students, as a sign of protest, came in barefoot to show disrespect. And Meghnad Saha, it's not clear. Different people have different take on this, but some say he used to come barefoot in any case. Whatever was the reason, Meghnad Saha was duly expelled from the school for showing disrespect. But because he was such a brilliant student, another private school gave him admission right away. So he continued his schooling. Saha's schooling in Dhaka coincided with the height of the Swadeshi movement in the region. The partition of Bengal in 1905, ostensibly to better administer the province, had given rise to massive protests. Students in Dhaka, like others all across Bengal, attended political meetings, joined processions, disobeyed school authorities, and picketed shops that sold foreign goods. The Swadeshi movement represented many strands: moderates, passive resistors, Hindu revivalists, and they were called political terrorists, some of them. Or revolutionaries, if you may, if that be a better word. The extent of Saha's involvement with the Swadeshi movement in Dhaka remains unclear. He seems to have been acquainted with Pulin Das, the founder of Dhaka Anushilan Samiti, a, quote, terrorist organization that from its very inception emphasized secret training of cadre through a physical culture and paraphernalia of vows steeped in Hinduism. However, there is no evidence that he joined Pulin Das's organization. It is worth noting that this period coincided with the movement for democratic rights by the Namashudras, a section of the so-called lower castes, who not only supported the partition of Bengal, but also staged counter boycotts of the upper castes by refusing to provide them agricultural and menial services. In Calcutta, where Saha moved to in 1911, he developed formal links with the revolutionaries. He joined the Calcutta Anushilan Samiti, one of whose charismatic leaders, Jatindra Mukherjee, known popularly as Bagha Jatin, for having killed a tiger with a dagger, was a frequent visitor at the students' dormitory where Saha resided. The Calcutta Samiti, by this time, had shed most of its religious overtones. Its death-defying heroism in the cause of complete independence, as well as its regeneration of interest in history, culture, science, and folk traditions, inspired generations of educated youth, including Saha and his classmates. The contact with the revolutionaries jeopardized Saha's chances of joining the Indian Finance Service, as the government of India did not allow him to sit for the civil service examinations needed to qualify for the position. As was pointed out earlier, that Saha was actually, his FRS was delayed because of his revolutionary activities. Although Saha's association with the Swadeshi movement was short, the movement inculcated an intense passion for history and literature in him. He read voraciously. One of his favorite books was Meghnad Bodho, The Slaying of Meghnad, the epic poem by Michael Madhusudan Dutt, which retells the story of Ramayana. Published in 1861, Meghnad Bodho is concerned with the story of the third and final battle between Meghnad, the son of Ravan, and Lakshman, Ram's brother. By skillful use of simile and by interweaving subsidiary tales from Mahabharata into the text, but without altering either the characters or the outcome of the original story, Madhusudan Dutt effectively subverted the traditional associations of good with the gods and evil with the demons. According to Seeley, Meghnad Dutt is a tale about the invisible, almost subliminal cloaking of Ravan in the finery of heroism, while Ram and his rabble go about stripped of their traditional garb of glory. Meghnad Bodho, as Bengalis say, I do not have that pronunciation, is primarily a veneration of modernity. Ashish Nandi describes Meghnad, portrayal of Meghnad, as courageous, proud, achievement-oriented, competitive, efficient, technologically superior, what we want our scientists to be these days, it seems, while Ram and Lakshman are weak-kneed, I quote, weak-kneed, passive-aggressive, feminine villains. In this context, in the context of the anti-Brahmin movements, especially in Tamil Nadu and Maharashtra in the 19th and 20th centuries, Meghnad Saha can also be read as a subversion of the caste hierarchies of the Hindu religion. Saha's disdain for ritualistic religion and his deep admiration for the virtues of modern science would have made him identify strongly with the character of Meghnad. The narrative style of Meghnad Saha too might have had its own appeal. In his epic, Madhusudan Dutt compares Ravan's court to the idyllic surroundings of Vraj and Meghnad to the deity Krishna. Brought up in the religious atmosphere of devotional Vaishnavism, where the playful antics of Krishna roaming free as a herdsman in the pleasure groves of Vraj are deeply revered, Saha would have been drawn almost instinctively towards Meghnad. Besides, blatant and persistent instances of caste prejudice weighed heavily upon him and inculcated in him a righteous anger at the injustices of the caste hierarchies. As a child, he'd been ordered by a priest to leave the dais where prayers were being offered to the goddess Saraswati, because he did not belong to the right caste. In the student residence at Eden Hindu Hostel in Calcutta, some students refused to eat with him in the dining hall, forcing Saha and, in protest, his fellow students Gyan Ghosh, Bhupen Ghosh, and Neel Ratan Dhar to set up residences elsewhere. In this context, it should come as no surprise that Saha changed his birth name, which was Meghnad, to Meghnad. According to his son Ajit, his grandparents had named their son Meghnad because he was born on a stormy night. Later on, it seems, in his youth, Saha changed it to Meghnad, as we know him. Ajit Saha's account has a ring of truth, as it is more in keeping with the names of Meghnad's elder brother, Jainath, and his father, Jagannath. This conscious and subversive gesture signifies Saha's assertion of a defiant, secular, and decidedly modern outlook in opposition to caste hierarchies of Hinduism. So it's not only he keeps his last name, but changes his first name, which I think is very significant. And earlier we were talking a little bit about Basu and Bose, but this name change I think is extraordinary given the times. Saha was also steadfast in his critique of caste hierarchies of his social world and their influence on science in India. In a Bengali essay, Saha asked rhetorically, quote, "Why should an illiterate priest who conducts wedding and funeral rites without understanding the mantras that he pronounces enjoy more social prestige than the weaver and the shoemaker?" He rejected out of hand the traditional rules of Indian society. I quote, "Both the weaver and the cobbler serve the society through hard labor, whereas the ignorant priest is, for all practical purposes, nothing but a cheat. If the son of the butcher in Europe had enough talent, he could have been a Shakespeare, but in this country, according to traditional rules, such a person could not have become a Rabindranath or a Kalidas. And if he had made any such attempt, the great god Ram himself would have chopped off his head in order to preserve the sacred caste system. There is no reason why a cobbler or his son, like Bata or Lloyd George, with the necessary talent, should not attain the highest position in society." The mid-1930s, I'm going to now talk about the allure of people science and his shift from thinking about economic systems as well. The mid-1930s in India ushered in a deepening sense that freedom from the British was not only inevitable, but imminent. To this end, nationalist scientists in India, in particular scientists associated with the journal Science and Culture, began to organize themselves for the task of national construction. Foremost among them was Meghnad Saha, an ardent and persistent advocate of large-scale scientific and industrial development. Saha had, in 1938, persuaded Subhash Chandra Bose to create a committee to scientifically plan the country's reconstruction. The National Planning Committee, which consisted of prominent political leaders and leading scientists, including Meghnad Saha, began its work in earnest and by 1949 had produced 27 volumes of reports outlining a comprehensive and integrated plan for independent India's development. Most of these things were not taken up by the government, unfortunately, but they worked extraordinarily hard to produce this volume. In planning for national reconstruction, Saha studied the development programs of many countries, including Sweden and the USSR. It is here that we begin to see the extraordinary impact Soviet Union had on his thinking. Prior to his engagement with the Soviet Union, Saha had subscribed to the view that, and I quote, "The developing miracle of science is at our disposal to use or abuse. But what should not be forgotten is the fundamental fact that if popular leaders and popular governments are intelligent and farsighted, if businessmen are more disinterested, and if we all work for social welfare and social justice, we can, with the aid of science, enter into an era of plenty and prosperity, where every man and woman in India can live in comfort, which would have been the envy of Emperor Shah Jahan." Further, he wrote, "Large-scale industrialization is imposed upon us by world conditions which nobody has the power to retard, as also by the exigencies of maintaining of a proper standard of life of India's millions. But by accepting industrialization, we are not necessarily committed to capitalism, Bolshevism, fascism, or any other possible ism. It is a scheme of social advancement and of social uplift necessitated by the laws of evolution, and the particular ism by which the objective is to be realized may be regarded for the moment as a secondary affair. At present rate, it appears to me that this is a strictly personal opinion, that a form of controlled capitalism in which the profit motive shall be subordinated to the ideal of social welfare and service will best suit Indian conditions and culture." He wrote this to Nehru in 1938. Saha's abiding faith in scientific and technological development remained unchallenged throughout his life. In his view, economic systems were subservient, if not irrelevant, to the confident march of science and industrialization toward greater progress and prosperity. Scientism and its incumbent notion of value-neutral technology ran deep in his ideological makeup. His commentaries have almost all the ingredients of scientism, an unfaltering faith in the neutrality of science and its ability to bring about universal prosperity and well-being, regardless of the social and economic system in which it is practiced. However, as he started his systematic study of the Soviet planning and reconstruction, Saha began to rethink his position on capitalism. Quote, "Planning can be done for a society of exploiting capitalists and exploited labor, as we now have in India, or for a new society where exploitation would be gradually eliminated and everybody would be assured of food, shelter, and employment," he wrote, adding that planning will take, quote, "a vitally different form according to that objective." In Lenin, Saha saw the ideal revolutionary leader. Again, I quote from him. He writes, "Lenin, inspired by the writings of Marx and Engels, was the first and almost a solitary figure amongst the rulers of the world to have realized early the great role which science was destined to play in the drama of human history. He realized that Tsarist Russia was, even on a very moderate estimate, 100 years behind her time as regards her economic and industrial development, And he foresaw that if the young Soviet Republic was to survive amidst the world of enemies, she was to jump off these 100 years by a forced march in course of 10 to 15 years. Saha was deeply impressed by the plan for the governmental electrification of Russia that was founded at the behest of Lenin. This plan, according to Saha, was not only a project for the restoration and new construction of electric stations and transmission lines on an astounding scale, but more importantly, a blueprint for the restoration and reconstruction of all national economy based on advanced technology. Lenin seemed to uphold Saha's opinion when he wrote in 1920 that unless Russia is placed on a different technical level higher than before, restoration of the national economy and communism are out of question. Communism communism for Lenin is the Soviet power plus electrification of the whole country, for without electrification, progress in industry is impossible. The conjoining of communism with electrification had deep resonance for Saha, who had always placed the interests of people at the forefront. Thus, Saha approvingly located the inspiration for Soviet planning in the Communist Manifesto. He quotes, "The manifesto is aimed at establishing a completely new organization of society, an organization in which industrial production would be directed not by entrepreneurs competing amongst themselves, but by society itself, according to a plan designated to satisfy the needs of all citizens. Society would expropriate from private ownership all means of production, transport, distribution, etc., and would dispose of them according to a definite plan with a definite aim in view." While Saha remained deeply sympathetic to Soviet Russia, he could also be quite critical. He lamented the lack of international news there, but applauded the enormous number of scientific, literary, and technical journals that were available to the Russian scientists. He also noticed that busts, statues, and pictures of Lenin and Stalin are to be found everywhere, and wondered whether, I quote, "in the midst of the newer USSR citizens, Comrade Lenin has taken the place of Jesus Christ and Comrade Stalin that of St. Paul." Given Saha's antipathy towards dogmatic religion, the elevation of Lenin and Stalin as demigods troubled him. And so he wrote about his discomfort about that. But he was not really, he was against dogmatic religion, but he also saw good in religion, and I quote, "The philosophy of kindliness and service to our fellow men was preached by all founders of great religions, and no doubt some great kings and ministers of religions in every country and at all ages tried to give effect to this altruistic philosophy. But the efforts were not successful for the simple reason that the methods of production and commodities were too inefficient to yield plenty for all, which is an indispensable condition for practical altruism. Science has achieved a target aimed at by the great founders of religion in advanced countries of the world. The effect of maldistribution of wealth due to historical causes are being rapidly cured by the introduction of social laws." So here he comes back again and again to the need for industrial development to be able to fulfill the needs of everybody. Notwithstanding his deep sympathies for a just, equitable, and egalitarian world, Saha insisted that neither political theories nor their execution interested him in the slightest bit. He was only concerned with the extraordinary use the Soviet Union had made of modern scientific knowledge in solving their problems of poverty and want, and the extremely judicious and businesslike fashion in which they proceeded with their schemes and coordinated the labor of economists and technicians alike. Saha saw scientific development as the only way out of the deepening religious differences in India. On the question of partition of India along religious lines and the various proposals put forward to avert it, Saha felt that deliberations on the issue were, quote, based more on sentiments than on any critical and scientific analysis of the circumstances. For the development of the natural resources of India alone could assure the well-beings of the masses. In an article written in 1945, he writes, quote, of late, the religious rivalries tending towards fanaticism have given rise to a very dangerous outlook which threatens the very existence of India as a nation that is the cry for its partition into two states based on preponderating populations professing different religions. It is absolutely unconnected with the reality of the situation, and if brought about, will make this unfortunate land a permanent wreckage and a place for famines, misery, and disasters. To the Muslims in India, freedom for India appears a Hindu Raj and their subordination to the Hindus. It means their being reduced to a minority. To the scheduled caste, it means domination by caste Hindus. Under this confusion, the central fact of the coordinated development of natural resources on strictly nationalist lines is completely lost sight of. What else but poverty and misery can the poor heirs of the poor man get after division, he asked rhetorically. In writing about religious and caste domination simultaneously, Saha drew attention to the commonality of the oppression of both Hindus and Dalits. He believed that to achieve freedom from want, from scourges of preventable diseases, from the evils of illiteracy, all communities have to pull their resources and work together, notwithstanding their religious and social differences. He saw India as an indivisible economic unit where any idea of partitioning it into different zones based on religious sentiments was tantamount to throwing the entire population into permanent bondage and misery, whether it be the Hindu zone or the Muslim zone. For scientific development was possible only by maintaining the unity of nature's resources. It's a theme that he keeps coming back to, the nature's resources, and the resources should be for the common people. Indeed, Saha went on to suggest that the basis of all constitutions should be a system designated to facilitate the development of natural resources, since it is on this development carried out under strictly democratic principles that a decent and comfortable living of the masses can be assured. Saha also conceded, much as he was a man of science and continued to praise science and believe in science, he also conceded that science, by virtue of the immense power it gave to people, had led to tremendous destruction in World War I. At the same time, however, he insisted that science had also laid bare the futility of wars. He recounted the response of a Cairo newspaper when a visiting foreign dignitary mocked the vanity of building the pyramids with slave labor to preserve the souls of the pharaohs. He writes, if the soul of the builder of the Great Pyramid could be released from his stony sepulchre, he could have retorted the Treaty of Versailles and the expenditure on the dreadnoughts and on military armaments and sacrificing the finest youths of the country before the bloody altar of nationalism were far greater absurdities. As 1/10 of the money wasted in war, if spent on internal development of the natural resources, would have given every belligerent country a far greater amount of security and prosperity than the politician ever dreamed to achieve by methods peculiar to them. Saha lamented the present faulty system of education which seeks to perpetuate the medieval mind and brings only a small percentage of the population under the humanizing influence of science. Medieval minds, according to Saha, foster competitive communalism in India and competitive nationalism in the free countries. To combat such medieval minds, Saha started the journal Science and Culture to discuss and disseminate advances in science for a wide public and to inculcate a scientific temperament in the nation. Saha believed that science is important only as long as it conduces to the development of culture and serves the cause of human progress. Science and culture also became the forum where government policies in science and technology were critically analyzed and new recommendations made. So if you read Science and Culture, there are detailed, very, very detailed critiques of the development plans and alternatives provided, but unfortunately the government was not, by that time, was really not interested in listening to Saha and the cohort around him that worked diligently on science and culture. Saha saw science and culture as an integrating force. He incorporated progressive views of civilization, etc., into that, and I'll just skip some. He recognized that dominant Western culture with its science and technology had played a part in, I quote, shaking our ancient social structures and our belief in time-honored religious dogmas and practices, in disturbing the economic life of the country, and in modifying the very ways of our thoughts. But though the two cultures stand face to face as thesis and antithesis, the synthesis is not in sight, according to Saha. So he's looking at East and West and trying to see if science can mediate the two cultures. Could I have some water, you think? Thanks. Science and culture was to follow the dialectical path, demanding at once the protection of the spinning wheel and the bullock cart to ensure that there be no unemployment, but at the same time advocating the adoption of modern economic life where old antiquated methods would be discarded without a sigh or tear when proper insurance against unemployment had been made. Although Saha was steadfastly opposed to the spinning wheel philosophy of Gandhi, he agreed with Gandhi's critique of aggressive and selfish industrialism. Science and Culture carried articles and editorials by Saha on a wide range of topics. He introduced his readers to new concepts in science regularly, discussed structures and priorities of various scientific institutions and organizations, calculated the power consumption and future energy needs of India, promoted an integrated approach of science and planning, and offered insightful critiques of specific government policies regarding different industries. He wrote many essays on archaeology and history, humanism and science, nationalism and minorities, need for calendar reform, Indian languages, war and famine. Thank you. Yeah, thanks. No, it's okay. Refugee rehabilitation, his own relatives were caught up in that process. And Saha worked extremely hard to get laws that were conducive to proper rehabilitation, and linguistic organizations of Indian provinces. However, all his essays were imbued with an obsession with science and scientific temperament. Even on the question of humanistic studies, Saha managed to bring in scientific temperament and science as history. I quote. He writes, "A pertinent question may be asked whether the so-called humanistic studies all deal with topics which breathe at all a humane atmosphere. Is not nationalistic literature in all countries permeated by vain jingo spirit? A national poem of Germany says that Germany is that land where every Frenchman is called a foe. There is another national poem which regards the aqueous regions of the earth as the exclusive property of that particular nation. The patriotic poet forgot that waterways are also needed for the convenience of the rest of mankind. This desire for exclusiveness and superiority has kept alive a narrow patriotism to the deterioration of international goodwill. While scientific studies accumulate knowledge as an international asset with the cooperation of persons living in widely separate areas separated areas, the humanistic studies taught in schools are always vitiated by a defective outlook, Saha wrote in 1941. Saha critiqued the teaching of history as an unending tale of destruction, murder, arson, large-scale massacres, legalized and unlegalized plunder, and recommended that a really humanistic history should emphasize, quote, the development of the human society brought about by scientific and industrial inventions, large-scale explorations, and the impact of cultures, and thus relate how all these have transformed human life in successive stages. The astonishing span of Saha's scholarship underscores his total immersion in the reconstruction of India. All the issues he dealt with were intimately connected with envisioning a modern Indian state where education would be of utmost importance. Here, he emphasized intellectual honesty as well as different modes of teaching. Saha strongly urged that science subjects be taught in the vernacular. He wrote, and this he shared with S.N. Bose and a lot of other scientists of his time. And he writes, my belief is that the present system is the most unnatural one. The student is asked to unlearn the ways of thinking which come to him naturally. I mean, you have to pardon the him all the time. I'm apologizing to the women, but Saha really has very little gender consciousness at this time. But so he always is only talking about boys being taught and etc. The student is asked to unlearn the ways of thinking which come to him most naturally and asked to think in a tongue, every word of which he must pick up and retain in his memory with an effort. Instead of allowing him sufficient time to familiarize himself with the language, we prescribe a time limit within which he must attain as much fluency in the language as the average English boy of 13 or 14. The result is that he has resource to a process of perpetual memorization and translation, a habit which he can never shake off afterwards. Further, in talking about scientific intellectual honesty, Saha writes, the object of teaching science should not be merely to cram the student's brain with knowledge of science and train him in scientific operations, but also to train him to understand the scientific method approach to all problems. Much depends on the teacher's personality, his ability to inspire love of science in the students, and above all, his intellectual honesty. If, after teaching the boys that the eclipse of the sun is due to the moon coming between the sun and the earth, and that of the moon due to its plunging periodically into the shadow of the earth, the school teacher and his pupils, if after teaching that, the school teacher and his pupils took a bath in the Ganges during or after an eclipse in order to wash away theirs or somebody else's sin caused by the momentary devouring of the sun or the moon by the demon Rahu, that would be called intellectual dishonesty. The object of science teaching would be entirely frustrated if the student did not learn to appreciate the value of scientific attitude in all matters involving human life and in his relations to man and nature. A great responsibility naturally devolves on the science teacher. He should not merely be an interpreter, but at the same time must be an exponent of his teachings. Scientific teaching, above all, must inculcate a scientific temperament, not just mere cramming of facts. On the issue of nuclear physics, Saha argued for an open and university-based research program rather than the Atomic Energy Commission, et cetera, that wanted to put it away from universities, and he fought very hard to have his own program in Calcutta University. He remained steadfastly opposed to the Atomic Energy Commission because it had, quote, enveloped itself in a cloud of secrecy. Speaking as a guest of honor at the 29th Annual General Meeting of the Geological Mining Society of India, held in Calcutta in 1953, Saha demonstrated against the impenetrable secrecy of the Indian Atomic Energy Commission. He charged the organization with publishing no budget, no program, no information about activities or achievements except some brief and uninformative press communiques since its inception, and protested in the name of science that there is no need for such a degree of secrecy. In a confidential memorandum to Nehru, Saha argued that India had hardly any information to keep back from foreign countries, and there should be nothing to keep back from Indian scientists and experts who can actually be quite helpful. This was especially so since the government had insisted that it had no military ambitions and had no intentions of developing atomic energy for military purposes. Of course, that was not true. But he writes that science has prevented us from having a correct atomic policies, and said that true facts of atomic energy and its implications should be placed before the country. Discussions and expert knowledge and viewpoints of different groups will enable a policy to be shaped. So this was in the early stages of atomic energy, and if Saha had been in more leadership position, I think we might have seen quite a different program. I could continue because Saha, as I said, there are 5 volumes of Saha's collected works. His interventions from the parliament, his work on the Damodar Valley program, on all kinds of things, on glass industry, on every kind. He wrote copiously, studying every detailed development plan that was put before, always keeping the interests of the common people in the forefront. And just to conclude, I want to say, in the introduction to the 3rd volume of the collected works of Meghnad Saha, Shantimoy Chatterjee writes, Saha was a prolific writer, though not a writer in the conventional sense. Saha never wrote for aesthetic reasons. He was a man of strong convictions, a strong sense of nationalism from which flew his sense of social commitment. Saha was also fiercely optimistic, as you can see, because that optimism that science and technology will actually create a better world. I wonder what he would think today as the economic disparity has skyrocketed in every country. Optimism not only about science, technology, and development, but equally about scientific temperament that would render obsolete notions of religious and caste differences, and indeed notions of nationalism itself. He was an internationalist to the core, something he had imbibed from his science. Thank you.
Comparing Abha and Saha.
Yeah. I mean, Anderson is fairly sympathetic to Saha. He writes about how Abha and Bhatnagar were in Nehru's orbit and Saha was not, and were able to get a lot more resources for their work. And Saha didn't do poorly, I must say, but did not have the same import or resources in comparison that some of these people had. So I think Bob gets it right in most of the places, but Bob really doesn't go into the peculiar ways in which Saha was such a different man, because he comes from a low caste, so-called low caste, comes from a Dalit background. comes from a very poor rural family. Most of the people that Nehru felt comfortable were people, urban people, urbane people. So, Saha, who had in fact contacted Nehru much before anybody else in the scientific circle ever did, just was not comfortable around Saha. Nehru was, he just, they belonged to different class and different ways of being. I mean, in some things, Nehru would have shared Saha's, philosophy, but I think in just the day-to-day interactions, it would be hard. And Saha really felt very, very strongly, rejected by Nehru. He never did forget that.
Is there anything about D.D. Kosambi, who is also a contemporary at that time, with similar views?
That Saha writes about Kosambi? No, I have not seen any. In fact, I've been very surprised. Just there is a mention once, a fleeting mention of Ambedkar. I mean, Ambedkar and Saha were together, I mean, in the sense at the similar times in England, etc. But except for one passing line that he had high respect for him, there is no engagement. And that really puzzles me because they were both involved politically as well. He had great respect for Mahatma Gandhi, but did not at all agree with, because Gandhi in some ways, as we face, climate change and other things, Gandhi was right on the environmental part of it, but at that, Saha remained completely and totally committed to industrial development.
So what about the relationship between Mahalanobis and Saha? Because both of them seem to be proponents of large-scale state intervention. Yeah. And was there a friendship between the men? What was their relationship?
Well, early on, as we saw, they wrote a book together where Saha and Bose were the main people who translated Einstein's relativity. But Mahalanobis was there, his name is there too, so they knew each other. My sense, there is a very revealing photograph if you go to the, Indian Statistical Institute where, they're both looking daggers at each other, or they're just scowling, not happy to be in each other's presence. I think they started to probably have differences. Again, those would be differences of class, because Mahalanobis was, kind of would go, they might have agreed on some things about the development and industrial development, they might, but I haven't seen any critique of either Mahalanobis's program or anything in Saha's writing, which I have done, read quite a bit of. Shantimoy Chatterjee also informs us that the 5 volumes that are there do not cover everything that he wrote, because there were lots of articles in the Bengali press. He would, write in various or speak in various forums, and he did what he could. It's a remarkable set of volumes, but it's by far not a complete set of work. All of these people who worked in science and culture, Saha was not alone. Is that the question, that who were the other scientists who were with him? I think Neil Ratan Dhar, Gyanendra Ghosh were a few people that come to mind. I think he's very close to Satyen Bose as well, much as, that book by Wally and Chandrasekhar, they tried to say that there was a lot of antipathy between them, but I think they were very, very close. In fact, I came across a letter that Meghnad writes to his son and says, please give it to, or he writes to his son and says, please deliver it because there was a lot of scientific information in it to Satyen. So I think every time he'd go to Dhaka, he'd go to see Satyen Bose. So I think they were very close friends, and these are mere rumors that, it seems that there's that I think, was it Polly that had come, or Dirac when he'd come, Saha didn't inform Bose, and there was a kind of falling out, but I have seen no evidence of that. So these are all just rumors that are circulating. Yeah.
He just established the academy in Allahabad.
Allahabad, yeah.
All the
Yeah.
What about Raman?
With Raman, he had.
Raman was also a kind of anti-establishment in the sense of.
Yeah, but in a very different
Did they
way.
agree at all on anything? Saha and Raman?
So when they were in Calcutta together, Saha did work with Raman, not really worked with him, but knew him and had respect for him. But I think over time, their relationship deteriorated significantly. And in fact, when I discussed this, when Raman was asked to resign from the directorship of Indian Institute of Science, they blamed Saha for that. They thought Saha was creating all this trouble, which is, I think, unfair, because Saha was not on the committee that asked for it. And they say it's the Bengali versus Tamil, controversy. And as you see from his writings, unless he practiced something that he did not believe in, it's very hard for me to believe that he would just be opposed to somebody just because they were Tamil. But there were other Bengalis on the committee. So why would people single out Saha, to be the sole enemy of Raman? It's true that they didn't get along, but if you actually look at the record, Saha plays very little role in that. They were, so. Yes. No, see, I mean, they were both lecturers, Bose and Saha. And then Saha goes to England. When he comes back, then he has a job in Allahabad. And in fact, when he's trying to build his laboratory there, as Anderson writes about it, that he asked Rockefeller to give some funds to create. It's a very, actually the lab still existed 10 years ago at Allahabad University, the old spectrometer that Saha had set up to do his work. So Raman happened to be in the US at that time and said, no, Saha is not an experimentalist, he's a theoretician. So discouraged Saha's application. So that also reached Saha, I bet, that didn't win him over. And then, of course, there was the Senate was on a different issue of democratization of the university. That was more with Ashutosh, Mukherjee at that time, the differences. I thought... Oh, I didn't ever hear that story. When was that? Yeah. But when is that? When are we talking about?
This was months before he went to Allahabad.
Is there a source for this? I would like to read that.
Yeah.
Because it's not either in any of his biographies that I have written, I have read either, or even A Journey into Light doesn't talk about it.
Sort of balancing between.
No. I can well believe it. It's just that I have not come across this story, but it's in the Bengali literature. I should really be reading Bengali books on the subject. Yeah, it's my weakness that I do not read Bengali. So. Thank you.